there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Robbie McClaran's Artist Talk on his exhibition that's currently supported by the Alexander Gallery, The Great River of the West. My name is Kate Simmons. I'm the gallery director for the Alexander Gallery at Clackamas Community College. And I'm very excited to be sharing this work with you today. The Great River of the West is a collection of photographic images McClaran has created by use of his 8x10 antique camera that documents the Columbia River Gorge. We're delighted to share his work with our students and with our campus community. And I'd especially like to thank the Oregon Arts Commission, the Ford Family Foundation, and the Regional Arts and Culture Council for supporting his body of work. Robbie McClaran is a Portland-based artist and photographer. He, in addition to his personal explorations of artistic explorations, he also shoots editorials, corporate and advertising photographic images, and his work has been featured in the New York Times, Time, Rolling Stones, and collected by major institutions, including the Portland Art Museum and the Museum of Southern Art. So thank you very much for joining us today. And hi, Robbie.
Hi there. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. I want to jump right into it. First of all, I'll get this out of the way. I grew up in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, hence the Southern accent. I bought my first camera right out of high school, and shortly thereafter enrolled in an art school that focused on photography in Kentucky. After the first year there, I transferred to the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester, New York, where I studied for a couple of years, finishing up in 1979. And then after a bit of traveling and knocking around, I ended up in Texas, where I started my working career as a magazine photographer, shooting editorial assignments for a really broad range of clients, broad range of subjects. And but I moved to Oregon in 1989. I like to say my first view of the Columbia River, it took my breath away. I grew up on the major river of the Arkansas River and not far from the Mississippi River, but nothing kind of prepares you for the grandeur of the Columbia that first time you see it. And I also was struck by the fact that I was driving down Interstate 84. I would see those Lewis and Clark signs that are everywhere, and it dawned on the irony that I was driving in a Isuzu Trooper pulling a U-Haul trailer and along the route that was very much the same as the Oregon Trail that the immigrants used to come across and settle in Oregon. And I attended in 1990, I attended a first salmon feast at the Celilo Longhouse, which is an ancient and traditional ceremony that is part of the Washute or Seven Drums religion. And it celebrates the return of the salmon each spring. And it was incredibly moving. And it was the first time that I came to, that I began to think about the river as being more than scenery or recreation and cheap electricity. So with that, I'm gonna launch my screen and begin to talk about some pictures. There we go. Is it working?
Yes.
Hey, working, okay. Fingers crossed. So as I mentioned, I was doing a lot of magazine work in the early 1990s. A lot of that work was political in nature and other controversial subjects, difficult subjects, and just a broad range of things. The nice thing about editorial work is it gave me a very wide latitude to experiment with different formats, different styles, but it was primarily focused on portraiture, environmental portraiture. I wasn't a landscape photographer, so to speak. I would occasionally shoot landscapes as part of projects, but my primary work focused on portraiture. And I've photographed artists, musicians. This is Catherine Dunn, the Portland author. This is Cheryl Strayed, and other eccentric characters. And I also would use magazine assignments to give me access to subjects that I was interested in. And a lot of times those pictures would wind up as part of personal projects. In about the mid 1990s, around 1996, I bought this 100-year-old Eastman Kodak 8x10 camera and began experimenting with it. Again, mostly making portraits with it. This is a picture that Alan Mevis took of me at the Oregon Country Fair. And I would make portraits of my family. This is my wife and my daughter, who's now 24. But I also began to think about using it for landscapes. And the first project that I began to really think about incorporating landscapes as part of the work was this in my home region of Southeast Arkansas, around the Mississippi and Arkansas Delta. And I should back up and say that, I never considered myself a landscape photographer in the sense of traditional landscape photography. When we think of traditional landscape photography, we might think of the Ansel Adams School, which is, this idealized, glorified, pristine version of nature. And I always appreciated the beauty and the craft that went into making the pictures, but I never was could never get it fully invested in them because it seemed like there was something missing that wasn't necessarily truthful to the idea that there were people that were part of that landscape and that people impacted those landscapes. It's said that when Ansel Adams was making his photographs in Yosemite, that there were people there, he just cropped them all out. And so many of us, we understand we came to view nature through the lens of these kinds of photographs, and it gives us a distorted idea of what nature is really all about. But anyway, as I moved through the Arkansas Delta, I would make portraits of people as I encountered them, and as well as photographs of old buildings, facades, and just generally things that appealed to me. I didn't approach this project with any great conceptual idea. It was just sort of part documentary, part nostalgia for my home area. Oh, I guess we saw that one already. Here we go. I made this photograph. I wanted to go, it was right after Johnny Cash had died, and I wanted to try and find his birthplace, which is just south of where I grew up. And this is as close as I could get. This is an old church and cemetery right in the area. And then this project kind of evolved out of the Delta project and was made over a period of several years and several road trips traveling across the Midwest and the South. And it also kind of followed suit of the Delta work in that I incorporated landscapes along with portraits of people as I met them. Utqiagvik, I believe is how you pronounce it. is the traditional Inupiat name for the town that was formerly known as Barrow, Alaska. And I had an assignment to go and do a story on oil, whether or not the debate over to drill for oil in the Arctic. And I booked a couple of extra days and to make a series of landscapes there during the winter. And it was in late February, early March. And so there was just a few hours of daylight. And you have to watch out for polar bears. But at any rate, this again turned into a small book project. And I was struck by the sculptural quality and the painterly quality of some of not only the landscapes, but the objects and the houses and buildings. And the ironic decorations, these palm trees that are made out of whale baleen. Then in 2008, the Portland Art Museum hosted an exhibition that was curated by Terry Totemeyer, Wild Beauty, which was historic photographs of the Columbia Gorge, beginning with Carlton Watkins photographs that he made in 1867. And then it went through the mid 1950s. And that project really resonated with me. But one of the things that really struck me was I became very curious about, well, what about the other parts of the river that aren't in the gorge? You know, those of us that live in Portland area, we're very familiar with the gorge, but you know, beyond, you go where the river peels off and heads north from I-84, a lot of us don't know that much about what goes on up that stretch, much less the stretch down below that goes past. So that was the original spark of the idea for my project, which was to photograph the entire length of the river from the source up in Canada and all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And I made the decision to use my old antique camera because I wanted the pictures to have this historic quality, this historic documentary quality, much in the same way as those old Carlton Watkins photographs. There's something about, there's 1,000 reasons not to use an 8x10 large format camera. It's expensive. Each sheet of film costs about $5 before you do anything with it. And so mistakes are very costly. It's very heavy. My backpack with tripod and film holders and lenses and the entire kit weighs about 40 pounds, which is a lot for an old man with a bad back. And I find myself, you know, not wanting to walk too far away from the car. But the one good reason to use the camera is this quality of the pictures. The longer focal length of the lenses compresses the scene and compresses the depth of field in a way that small cameras just don't. And there's a sharpness to the images that, and because the lenses are older and uncoated lenses, they render the contrast just a little bit differently. It's a subtle thing and maybe something that most viewers won't get, but it was something that I wanted to do and I felt important. So I began the, let's see, there we go. So symbolically, I wanted to begin the project at out at Kelly Point, where the Willamette River meets the Columbia. And so I made that first photograph in fall of 2013. And then I made my progress as my time and my finances would allow. Initially, it was all self-financed, but I was very curious to go all the way up to the source of the Columbia. And and the source is considered Columbia Lake, but at the head of the lake is this series of springs that come up out of the ground in this marshy area and turn into small rivulets and creeks, and that's what feeds the lake. And the lake is quite large, maybe 10, 15 miles long, a couple of miles across at its widest point. And then from the kind of northwestern end of the lake is where the river begins to flow. Here's my camera set up making that picture. But that shadow, by the way, is not the camera. That's a tree that's just behind me. At first it fooled me. I thought, is that the camera making that giant shadow? But anyway, just about a mile downstream from where the river becomes a river is a golf course. And it struck me as a little humorous and ironic, and it set the stage for, I had made the decision very early on that I wanted to include the images that showed the human impacts. And so backing up to my thoughts about landscape photography, on the opposite end of the spectrum from the Ansel Adams Pristine Nature School is the sort of documentary photography that uses pictures to document the destruction of the environment, to show pollution and all of that. And so what I wanted my project to be is I wanted to see if I could thread the needle somehow and make pictures that neither hid from the beauty of the landscape, but also didn't hide from the human impacts. Sometimes those scenes were pretty and sometimes less so. And so as the river begins to flow, it flows in a northwesterly direction and winds its way through the Rocky Mountain Trench and the Columbia wetlands in a serpentine kind of manner. It sometimes disappears into marshes and then reappears as a small stream, and gradually as creeks continue to flow into it, it gets wider and wider. But it's those first 100 or so miles, it's really quite beautiful and not very populated. There's a little bit of industry. There's a sawmill or two, and there are some roads and some small towns, but it's largely unpopulated and largely looks much as it did early on. But then as the river begins to back up into the first of the series of lakes that are behind the 14 dams on the mainstream of the Columbia, you begin to see more and more human impacts. Kenbasket Lake is the first of those lakes, and it's largely inaccessible only by logging roads. And it's, you know, to use a cliche, it's literally in the middle of nowhere. And I was very, very curious after reading some accounts of in particular, Robin Cody is an author who wrote a book about his solo canoe trip through down the entire length of the Columbia, and his description of Kenbasket Lake fascinated me. And one of the things that's interesting about Kenbasket Lake is that the dam is used to generate electricity, but it's also the primary purpose of the lake is to store water in the winter, so that they can release water in the winter months to maintain a steady flow for the downstream power generating dams. So when I was there to make this picture in June, the lake was just beginning to refill after it had drained down almost to the original river level. This is Mica Dam, which is again the first of uh, the 14 dams, and it's really quite dramatic. It's also literally in the middle of nowhere and stands, I think, 700, 800 feet above the river below. It's incredibly beautiful area. And I have read that it's also vulnerable to seismic activity. Were the wrong kind of earthquake to happen, it could be devastating. This is a historic photograph that I found of the canyon below Mica Dam, which is now flooded into Lake Revelstoke behind Revelstoke Dam. Also very remote. There is a paved road that goes all the way up to Mica Dam, but very little in the way of recreational areas. There's only a couple of campgrounds, a couple of RV parks and what have you. As opposed to backing up to Kenbasket Lake, there's literally no recreation area. There's no campgrounds. It's really only accessed by loggers, and then a few fishermen will tow their boats up and put in. As I made my way down the river below Revelstoke, you come to the Arrow Lakes. This is in Nakusp, British Columbia, in the town, in this beach, a swimming beach. And I made the decision back early on that I also wanted to address the idea that Europeans were not the first to live and live along the river. In Trail, British Columbia, which is just above the border of the Canada and US, is the Tech Comico lead smelter. And at one time it was considered one of the most polluted places in North America. But they had terrible problems, and I think the lifespan of Trail residents was as low as in the 45. Sometime back in the 1980s, they began to clean up the smelter, but it's still in production. This is above the border of the US border crossing where the river flows through, just below Trail. And this is at Kettle Falls in Washington. When Kettle Falls was once one of the most important native fishing grounds along the entire river. Archaeological evidence shows that indigenous people fished here for 9,000 years, and they fished primarily by spearing salmon, and they would use spears with points chipped from quartzite. This photograph is taken at the Kettle Falls recreation area. And when they built Grand Coulee Dam that backed up Lake Roosevelt, there was no provision, there was no fish ladder. So when the dam was completed, salmon were blocked from being able to continue their migration back upstream. So effectively, wild salmon have been extinct since the 1940s completion of Grand Coulee Dam. And the native people of the Confederated Tribes, the Sanpoil, the Spokane, the Colville, and the others were never really compensated for the loss of the fish and the destruction of their traditional way of life. And it was devastating to their culture. And this photograph was taken at a recreation area, a boat dock, where white fishermen put their boats in the water to go out and fish for non-native species. And there was just something kind of tragic and sad and ironic about that scene for me. This is a quartzite boulder that I found at approximately the site of where the Kettle Falls would be. And I was struck by these marks on the top, on the boulder's top. And it struck me that I became curious whether or not these marks were created as the quartzite was chipped away to make spear points and arrow points. And I have no evidence to prove that, but to me, it's just an intriguing possibility. And it struck me again that this was hallowed ground that had been, used by humans for millennia. When you first lay eyes on Grand Coulee Dam, it's really mind-boggling. The scale of the dam is hard to imagine. The statistics are kind of mind-boggling. In brief, it's almost a mile across. It's something like 900 feet wide at its base at the riverbed. And I read one statistic that if you took all the concrete that was used to build Grand Coulee Dam, you could pave the entire state of Texas 6 inches deep. It was the biggest thing ever built and remains to this day one of within the top 2 or 3 largest concrete structures in the world. But again, and it's got a fascinating history. It was originally built by the Bureau of Reclamation as a water project to irrigate the millions of acres of desert land and open it up to farmers. That project has had some success, but it's come at a great cost. And again, the natives whose land was above the dam were never really compensated for the loss of the fish, nor did they ever benefit from the irrigation water, nor did they benefit from the electricity. It was only in the late 1990s, I believe, that the Confederated Tribes successfully sued the Bureau of Reclamation and received a settlement as part of that loss. But as I made my way downstream below Grand Coulee and closer to Priest Rapids and area, you get into the area that was once the homeland of the Wanapum, which was one of the native groups that was the most fascinating to me. And this particular area around Vantage, it was rich with pictographs and rock drawings, many of which were lost when the dams flooded the river. Some were reclaimed. And then up above the river on the Yakima Training Center, an enormous military training ground that's on the highlands above the river that's closed off to the public. I met an archaeologist who is studying a lot of those pictograph areas and trying to document them. But I was struck as I came across graffiti on the rocks that, what is graffiti except, another form of making pictographs. And when I saw this particular piece, it really intrigued me. I didn't know what that symbol was, but at any rate, so I've referred to this as graffiti and or modern pictograph. Making your way down straight, the what's considered the last free-flowing section of the Columbia is the Hanford Reach. And on one side of the river, the east bank of the river, is the Hanford Wildlife Refuge. And on the opposite bank, the western bank, is the enormous Hanford nuclear site, which is where the Manhattan Project developed the plutonium to and the first and most of our nuclear weapons. And I wanted to get as close to the Hanford reservation as I could. And that in the distance is one of the, I believe it's the F reactor that developed plutonium for some of those earliest weapons. And again, this was once the homeland of the Wanapum. As I made my way downstream, I came across this mulberry tree and with a target on it, and it intrigued me. And later on, when I got home and I wanted to find out if mulberry trees were native to this area, and it turns out they were. And then I came across this fascinating story. In the 1990s, two scientists gathered wild mulberries and made several jars of jam. And of course, the Hanford, let me just back up for a minute. Hanford has major environmental problems. In the 50s, they were not, in the 40s and the 50s, they didn't know nearly as much as they do now about the dangers of the nuclear waste and how to store it properly. And so a lot of that waste has made its way into the soil and the groundwater. And there are some major concerns about the impacts of that, both short-term and long-term, on wildlife and vegetation. And of course, the Grand Coulee Dam provided the power that was needed for to kind of run Hanford in the first place. So while Grand Coulee was originally developed for water reclamation, the power is what helped to win World War II. It also provided power for the shipyards in Seattle. At any rate, so back to my story about mulberries. These two scientists gathered and made several jars of jam from the wild mulberries. And then they mailed them to the US Department of Energy, Secretary of Energy, and the governor of Washington. And they labeled the jars "do not eat," contaminated with strontium-96 or whatever the chemical is. I can't remember, I'm not a chemist. And I just thought that was a fascinating form of protest. This is the Twin Sisters, which is at the Wallula Gap, where the river begins to make its westerly turn towards the Pacific. The Twin Sisters, again, is an ancient site that was used by many of the natives as a place for their young to go on their vision quests and what have you. And as I mentioned before, when I looking at the wild beauty photographs, there were historical photographs made by Lily White and then Carlton Watkins. And this is a site near Celilo called Cape Horn, or Cape Horn East, it's sometimes called, or Cape Horn. And so I really wanted to photograph this same site. And I had seen a couple of other pictures made by, more recently, this is by a landscape photographer based in Southern California named Mark Ruidel. And so I really wanted to go to this same spot and make my own version of the picture. And so This is up above and looking east towards Celilo Village and across to Wishram. And of course, Celilo was, again, not only an ancient and extremely important fishing ground for Native peoples, but it was also a trading place where natives from all over North America would come to trade for fish. It was extremely important for the economy of the Native people, and it was flooded by the building of the Dalles Dam, and of course, the damming of the river made navigating those falls possible for movement of goods up and down the river by way of barges and whatnot, and just another form of industrialization. This is the Dalles Dam. And it's difficult to see, but if you look very closely at water's edge, you'll see some what appear to be teepee type, structures, and those are native fishing platforms. In making my way down, I'd always used to get a kick out of seeing this sign, "Keep Skamania County Green," painted on the rock. This is an abandoned sawmill in the very tip of Sauvie Island, taken from St. Helens, Oregon. And if you look very carefully, you can see Mount Hood in the distance. And this is on Sauvie Island. One of the earlier pictures that I made for the project. I discovered my daughter had enrolled in Sarah Lawrence College, and I discovered that one of my favorite photographers, one of my sort of heroes, so to speak, Joel Sternfeld, was a professor at Sarah Lawrence. And so I went back and was looking at Joel Sternfeld's pictures, and I discovered that he had photographed in the 1970s. He had photographed this exact same location with his 8x10 camera, but it looked quite different. It was in color, but I got a kick out of seeing that. And then as I made my way all the way out towards the Pacific, this is up at Cape Disappointment. I think this was the longest hike that I had to take with a camera to get from the parked car up to the viewpoint at Cape Disappointment. And I thought I was gonna die. It's not a long hike, it's maybe a half a mile, but it's very steep. And carrying all that weight, I thought it was gonna kill me. But this is looking east back towards Astoria, which is obscured in the fog in the distance. And then this is looking west towards out to the Pacific with the jetty on the north jetty on the right and the south jetty in the distance on the far left. This is made from Waikiki Beach there at Cape Disappointment. And so I'm going to see if I can exit out of here. There's a quote that I like to throw out there, and I can't even remember who said it, but I think it applies. But it said, "Being a photographer, it's a lousy living, but it's an incredible life." And so I've kind of lived that. I feel very fortunate to have had the career that I've had, to have the experiences that I've had, and that I've managed to make a reasonably decent living for most of those years.
Thank you so much for sharing your work with us today. And thank you, Kelly, for putting the link to the Alexander Gallery virtual exhibition in the chat there. I just want to remind everybody, if you haven't seen the work, you can do so at www.clackamascommunitycollegeart.com, Alexander Gallery. And I would also like to let everybody know, I hope you can join us next time for our second exhibition of winter term, which will be the work of Sean Krogan, which will run February 15th through March 19th. So thank you for joining us today. And thank you so much, Robbie, for telling us about your